In a small classroom on the south side of Fort Worth, Texas, a 12-year-old girl raised her hand. Her name was Amara Blake. She did not wait to see if others were ready. She did not measure her pride against the weight of silence in the room. With her back straight, her voice steady, she spoke. My mother is in Congress. Her name is Jasmine Crockett. You would think such words would fall with the sound of history, carrying the dignity of ancestors who fought for centuries to open that very door. But instead, the teacher chuckled, a sharp, cutting sound that sliced through her truth. Mr. Penley, with his marker still in hand, wrote her name beside fictional characters on the board. The classroom shifted. A few eyes turned. A few shoulders moved uncomfortably, but no one spoke for her. Not even her closest friend. What Amara felt in that moment is something too many of us know. Well, it was not sadness, exactly. It was not anger alone. It was the familiar sting of being unseen. The feeling that no matter how clear our truth is, no matter how strong our pride may be, someone will look at us and laugh as if we were making it up. For generations, this has been the rhythm of our existence in America. Our people built the land, worked the soil, raised the buildings, raised the children of this nation. Yet our voices were doubted, our dignity mocked, our worth measured as 3/5 of a human being. Black hands built empires, but black truth was treated like a myth. And in that classroom, in the 21st century, that same disbelief found its way to a 12-year-old girl. This is not just a story about a student being disrespected. This is not only about a mother's career. It is about the deeper question: what happens when our children speak the truth and the world answers with laughter? For Amara, the world felt muted after that day. She walked the halls of her school in silence. She ate her lunch on the far side of the table. She went home and told her mother nothing. And how many of us have carried that same silence? How many times have we chosen not to speak because we knew the cost? But silence does not last forever. There comes a moment when the truth walks into the room with such weight that no laughter can drown it. For Amara, that moment came when the doors of her school auditorium opened and her mother entered. Not a story, not a myth. It's not a punchline, but living proof. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped forward in a tailored black suit, gold hoops catching the light. She did not arrive with banners, nor did she bring an entourage. She came as she always had, a daughter of working-class parents, a lawyer who defended the voiceless, and now a woman in Congress who carried both steel and tenderness in equal measure. Her very presence rewrote the script. She embraced her daughter in front of everyone, without shame, without spectacle. Then she took the stage and spoke words that would echo long after the assembly ended. Sometimes we assume we know who someone is based on how they look, or how they speak, or where they sit in the classroom. But the truth is, power doesn't always wear a name tag, and dignity doesn't need permission. And when someone tells you who they are, believe them. That is why this story matters, because it is not only about Amara and Jasmine, it is about every voice that has been doubted, every truth that has been silenced, every child who was told that their pride was a lie. It is about all of us who carry Africa in our blood, justice in our bones, and the memory of ancestors who dreamed of a future where our voices could not be laughed away. Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. Hãy giúp và đồng hành vì một tiếng nói ra màu không còn bị ngắt lời. Over the next hour, we will walk together through the silence, the laughter, and the breaking of both. We will travel from a classroom in Fort Worth to the halls of Congress, from a young girl's hurt to a community's pride. This is the story of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, but it is also your story. It is our story. A story about the power of truth when it finally walks into the room. History does not only live in monuments or textbooks, it lives in the smallest rooms, in the most ordinary moments, in the silences that follow when truth is spoken and then doubted. To understand the story of Amara Blake and her mother, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, we must begin not with applause or headlines, but with a sound far more familiar to our people, the sound of laughter used as dismissal in a classroom in Fort Worth, Texas. Amara's hand shot up. She was 12 years old. Her curls framed by a pink hoodie she wore nearly every Friday. The teacher had asked the students to name someone they admired in government. Others were ready with expected names: a governor, a senator, even a mayor. Amara did not hesitate. She straightened her back and said with quiet pride, "My mom, she's in Congress. Her name is Jasmine Crockett." The room fell silent, not the respectful kind of silence, but the uneasy kind that comes when people are unsure whether to believe. And then it happened. Mr. Penley, the teacher, chuckled, not a laugh of joy, but a sharp chuckle, the kind that dismisses before it even considers. He turned to the whiteboard and scribbled Amara's name beside fictional characters. That was all it took. A classroom full of children, a teacher with authority, and a truth erased in a single stroke. Amara's chest burned. Her lips parted, as if to protest, but no sound came. Even her best friend Elise looked down, unsure of what to say. To some, this might have seemed a small moment, a misunderstanding in a classroom, but for Amara and for generations before her, it was not small at all. It was part of a much older pattern, a shadow cast by centuries of disbelief, aimed at black voices. Think back to the plantation fields, where enslaved children whispered songs of freedom that overseers dismissed as nonsense. Think of Reconstruction, when black men were elected to office, but their legitimacy was mocked, their victories erased by violence. Think of the segregated schools of the 20th century, where black students carried torn books and were told they were lucky to have even those. In each of these moments, the truth of our people was doubted. The dignity of our voices was diminished. That disbelief did not vanish with civil rights legislation. It lingers in the way black patients are told their pain is exaggerated. It lingers in the way job applications with black names are set aside. It lingers in classrooms where black excellence must be proven twice before it is acknowledged once. So when Amara said, "My mom is in Congress," her words collided with that legacy. To Mr. Penley, it seemed improbable. How could a girl from the south side of Fort Worth, with brown skin and a soft voice, carry such a lineage? His imagination, trained by history, did not stretch far enough to accept her truth. But who was the woman behind Amara's words? To understand that, we step into another story. Jasmine Crockett was not born into power. She did not inherit wealth or influence. Her roots were working class. Her mother cleaned houses. Her father laid drywall. They lived in modest brick homes, ordinary on the outside but rich with resilience inside. From that soil grew determination. Jasmine fought her way through school, earned her place in law, and became a public defender in Dallas. She did not chase easy victories. She defended those who had no one else. Each case was another reminder that justice was not neutral, and that truth often needed someone bold enough to carry it into the courtroom. And when Jasmine Crockett entered Congress, she carried that same spirit with her. She was not polished by privilege. She was sharpened by struggle. She wore her gold hoops as armor, her words as blades, and her presence as testimony that our people had not only survived history, but were now rewriting it. Still, none of this mattered to Mr. Penley that day. In his classroom, Amara's truth was treated as fiction. That wound went deeper than embarrassment. It reached into the inheritance of silence our people have carried for centuries. Amara walked home that afternoon in quiet, past the grocery store, past the gas station, past the church with its crooked sign. She entered a house filled with life art on the walls, plants in every corner, the scent of vanilla candles, but carried a silence heavier than the backpack on her shoulders. She did not tell her mother what had happened. She swallowed it, like so many of us have done. But history is not only about wounds, it is also about the fight that grows from them. From Harriet Tubman, guiding the enslaved to freedom, to Rosa Parks, refusing to surrender her seat, to Shirley Chisholm, declaring herself unbought and unbossed in the halls of Congress, there has always been a counter story. A story of voices that refuse to shrink. Jasmine Crockett belongs to that tradition. She is not the first, and she will not be the last, but her presence reminds us that history is not finished. It still asks the same question of each generation. When truth is spoken by those the world expects least, will we laugh or will we listen? Amara did not yet know all this. She did not yet see herself as an heir to that long struggle, but she felt it. She felt it in the silence of her classmates, in the doubt on Elise's face, in the chuckle of her teacher. She felt the weight of history pressing down on her 12-year-old shoulders. That day was more than a lesson in government. It was a reminder that the fight for belief, for dignity, for truth continues in classrooms just as much as in Congress. It was a reminder that this belief is not only personal, it is historical. And it was the beginning of a story where laughter would soon be answered by presence. For history does not stay buried. It walks into our classrooms. It stands in our courtrooms. It takes its place in Congress. And sometimes, it enters the room wearing a black suit and gold hoops, ready to remind the world that when we speak, we mean to be believed. This is the soil where our story begins, a silence heavy with history, a laugh that echoes centuries, and a truth waiting to break free. Every journey begins with soil. For Jasmine Crockett, that soil was not soft or easy. It was hard, rough, and lined with calloused hands. Her roots were planted in the working-class heart of Texas, where her mother cleaned houses and her father laid drywall. They lived in narrow brick homes, with yards that bore the marks of labor more than leisure. Poverty was always near, but so was pride. Jasmine grew up watching her parents stretch every dollar until it sang. Her mother would come home late, her hands raw from scrubbing floors in houses far bigger than their own. Her father returned from job sites with dust still clinging to his clothes, the smell of sweat and plaster lingering long after he had washed. They did not complain. They simply carried on, as their parents had before them. As black families across America had always done, working harder than anyone else, yet often being seen the least. But even as a child, Jasmine understood something. Survival was not enough. She wanted more. She wanted justice. She saw how her parents' dignity was too often overlooked. She saw neighbors denied opportunities, friends' parents dismissed by employers, voices ignored because they did not come from the right side of town. These small injustices built up inside her like bricks, and one day, she decided she would not only carry them, she would fight them. That decision led her into classrooms of her own, first as a student, later as a law scholar. She studied not to impress, but to arm herself. Every page she read, every case she memorized was another weapon against the silence that had been imposed on her people for generations. When she was tired, she remembered her mother's bent back over a mop. When she felt defeated, she thought of her father's hands, rough with labor, but steady with love. Law school was not built for someone like her. The faces in the lecture halls were mostly white, the voices of professors steeped in privilege. Yet Jasmine stated she sharpened herself against doubt, against assumption, against every sideways glance that suggested she did not belong. Each test passed was more than an academic victory. It was proof that she could carve space in a system not meant for her. When she became a public defender in Dallas, she stepped fully into her calling. The courtroom became her battlefield. She stood for those who could not afford a lawyer, for those whose voices were silenced by poverty or prejudice. She spoke for young men pulled over without cause, for mothers accused of crimes they did not commit, for families who faced a legal system that never seemed to stand on their side. And through it all, she carried herself with a mixture of fire and grace. Her colleagues began to notice something about her style. She was unflinching, yet she never lost her humanity. She could cross-examine with the sharpness of a blade, but she spoke to her clients with the gentleness of a sister. This duality, steel and softness, would become the hallmark of her career. At home, that duality shaped the way she raised Amara. From the time her daughter was small, Jasmine would kneel down to meet her eye to eye and speak words that cut through centuries of doubt. You don't need to shrink. Baby, people will try to make you feel small. Don't hand them the scissors. Amara carried those words like a secret shield. She taped them on the corkboard above her desk, tucked them between her sketches and magazine cutouts. She did not always believe them, especially after the laughter in her classroom, but she kept them close, waiting for the day she could. Being the daughter of a congresswoman was never simple. While other mothers attended every school meeting or baked for fundraisers, Jasmine often had to work late, caught in hearings, interviews, or flights back from Washington. Amara sometimes resented the empty chair at family events, the long nights when the house felt too quiet. But she also understood that her mother's absence was not abandonment. It was sacrifice. Jasmine was not missing from her life. She was out there fighting for lives like theirs. Wednesday nights were their ritual of repair. No matter the schedule, no matter the distance, Jasmine would make time for movie night. They would eat popcorn, laugh at old comedies, and for a few hours, the world would shrink to just the two of them. Sundays carried another ritual: pancakes, always a little burnt at the edges, always eaten together at the kitchen table. These small traditions stitched them together, reminding Amara that even if her mother belonged to the public, she also belonged to her. But beyond the laughter and the rituals, Amara began to sense the weight her mother carried. She saw it in the late-night phone calls, the furrowed brow over stacks of documents, the sighs that slipped out when Jasmine thought no one was listening. Amara knew, even if she did not yet understand, her mother's life was not only her own, it was part of something larger, something both noble and dangerous. And so, the daughter's journey mirrored the mother's. Jasmine's early battles in classrooms and courtrooms had forged her into a woman of steel. Amara's battles were smaller, quieter, the side eyes of classmates, the chuckle of a teacher. Yet both were born from the same soil. Both were shaped by the same history of doubt and the same determination to stand tall anyway. The beginning of Jasmine's journey was not about glory. It was about grit. It was about a young black woman who refused to shrink, who refused to believe the story that the world wrote for her. And the beginning of Amara's journey was the same. She was learning, painfully, that the world would not always believe her truth. But she was also learning, quietly, that she carried within her the fire of her mother's fight. This was the path they walked together, one forged by history, carried by sacrifice, and lit by the promise that truth, no matter how small or doubted, has the power to break through silence. The United States Congress is a theater of power. Beneath the chandeliers and marble pillars lies a constant struggle, one where words are weapons and silence is strategy. It is here that Jasmine Crockett found herself, a woman shaped by the grit of Dallas courtrooms, now standing in the highest legislative chamber of the land. From her very first day, Jasmine understood the terrain. She was not expected to be there. Not truly. The corridors of power had been carved by white hands, their portraits lining the walls, their voices echoing in tradition. But Jasmine did not walk in seeking permission. She walked in, carrying the stories of those who had never been heard. Her armor was not only her black suit and gold hoops, but the memory of her mother scrubbing floors and her father building walls for other people's homes. She faced adversaries who underestimated her at every turn. Some dismissed her as too young in political years, too fiery in her tone, too bold in her questions. Others mocked her accent, her style, even her insistence on naming the truths others wished to bury. But Jasmine did not bend. When opponents tried to cut her off mid-sentence, she pressed forward, her voice steady and sharp. When they rolled their eyes at her challenges, she sharpened her questions until the chamber grew quiet, forced to listen. One hearing in particular became a defining moment. As members of the committee danced around corruption, Jasmine leaned forward, her words precise. "You may prefer silence," she said, her eyes locking onto her opponent. "But I was not sent here to make you comfortable. I was sent here to tell the truth." The room stilled. Cameras caught the flicker of unease on her adversary's face. The headlines the next morning did not say much about policy, but they carried her name. For those who had longed to hear a voice like theirs in Congress, Jasmine had become a symbol. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Amara was fighting her own battles. They were smaller in scale, yet just as heavy. In her classroom, the laughter of Mr. Penley still echoed in her ears. Each day she sat a little quieter, hands folded neatly on her desk. The words she longed to speak caught in her throat. Her classmates answered questions about governors, senators, presidents, and their words were received without question. When Amara raised her hand, there was always a pause, always a flicker of doubt. Before her teacher acknowledged her, it is a strange thing how prejudice wears different masks in different spaces. In Washington, Jasmine's opponents attacked openly, their words recorded on national television. In Fort Worth, Amara's struggle was cloaked in silence, in the absence of recognition, in the lack of belief. Both mother and daughter were caught in the same story, battling disbelief on two fronts. At night, their lives overlapped in the kitchen of their modest home. Jasmine with papers spread across the counter, Amara with a sketchpad balanced on her lap. The television murmured in the background, headlines flashing Jasmine's name, while Amara traced lines absent-mindedly, wishing her own voice carried weight in her world the way her mother's did in Washington. "Did you win today, Mama?" Amara asked once, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. Jasmine looked up from her notes, the smile tugging at her lips. "Winning isn't always the point, baby. Speaking is." That answer stayed with Amara. It sounded noble, but she wondered what it meant for her. In class, she had spoken. She had told the truth. And what had it brought her? Laughter, dismissal, silence. If speaking was the point, why did it feel so heavy, so lonely? The truth is that battles are rarely measured in single victories. Jasmine knew this well. She had studied the women who came before her. Shirley Chisholm, who once declared herself unbought and unbossed. Barbara Jordan, who thundered during the Watergate hearings with the voice of moral clarity. Maxine Waters, who refused to yield even when opponents tried to cut her short. Each had been underestimated. Each had been mocked. But their words outlasted the laughter. Their presence outlasted the disbelief. Jasmine belonged to that lineage, and in ways she did not yet realize. So did Amara. The battles they faced, one in Congress, one in a classroom, were chapters of the same story. Both required the courage to keep speaking, even when no one wanted to hear. Both demanded resilience against the corrosive power of doubt. The press began to take notice of Jasmine more and more. Some outlets praised her as a rising star, a truth teller, unafraid of the establishment. Others criticized her as too aggressive, too confrontational. a troublemaker in the genteel theater of Congress. These contradictions did not surprise her. To be a black woman in politics was to be called both too much and not enough, sometimes in the same breath. And while the nation debated her tone, her daughter wrestled with her own silence. In the cafeteria, Amara sat apart, her lunch tray barely touched. Friends spoke about TikTok trends, about sneakers, about anything but the moment in class that had split Amara's world in two. Elise, her closest friend, offered small talk but avoided the subject. Amara smiled when spoken to, but the smile never reached her eyes. In both Washington and Fort Worth, the same question loomed: whose voices deserved to be believed? For Jasmine, the stakes were national. For Amara, the stakes were personal. Yet both knew, even if only one could name it, that belief itself is political. When you dismiss a child's truth, you teach them their words carry no weight. When you silence a congresswoman, you signal that justice itself is optional. And so their battles continued. Jasmine prepared for another hearing, another clash with colleagues who wanted her quiet. Amara braced herself for another school day, another silent lunch, of another chance to raise her hand only to be doubted. Different stages, different scales, the same fight. And so we must ask ourselves, just as they ask themselves each day, if you believe this is what justice should have always sounded like, say truth in the comments below. Friday morning began like any other. Gray clouds drifted over Fort Worth, the air heavy with the dull rhythm of an ordinary school day. Amara sat in homeroom with her hood pulled tight around her curls, her head bent low over her desk. She heard the chatter about the assembly scheduled for later that day, but she paid it no mind. Rumors swirled. A city council member, maybe a superintendent, nothing that seemed worth the weight of her attention. By fourth period, the tension in her chest was almost routine. She followed her classmates down the hall to the auditorium, sneakers squeaking against the tiles. She slipped into a seat near the back, slouching low, trying to disappear. On stage stood a simple podium beneath harsh lights. The principal's voice rang through the microphone, cheerful and thin. Today, she said, we welcome a very special guest from Washington, 2D. C, someone who has been working hard to represent our state on the most important issues facing young people like you. Amara's heart skipped. She barely processed the words until the next line landed like a thunderclap. Please give a warm welcome to United States Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. For a moment, Amara thought she had misheard. Her body went rigid. Then the side doors opened, and there she was. Jasmine Crockett did not enter with fanfare. She did not need it. She walked with the calm assurance of a woman who had fought too many battles to be unsettled by the whispers of children. Her black suit cut sharp against the dim light, her gold hoops catching the glow as though they carried their own fire. She moved down the aisle with a steady stride, every step bending the silence of the room around her. Students who had never before seen a congresswoman leaned forward. Teachers straightened unconsciously in their seats. Evan Mr. Panley, perched near the side, shifted as if unsure of how to hold himself. Amara sat frozen, her breath caught in her chest. She had imagined this moment in daydreams, but reality felt heavier. When her mother stopped beside her, opened her arms, Amara rose in a daze. They embraced, not as a performance, but as a mother and daughter bound by truth. For the first time since that chuckle in class, Amara felt whole again. Then Jasmine turned, stepped onto the stage, and faced the room. She adjusted the microphone with hands that did not tremble. Her voice, when it came, was low, measured, warm. Good morning, she began. I hear y'all weren't expecting me. A ripple of nervous laughter rolled through the room, but Jasmine did not laugh with them. Instead, she allowed the silence that followed to settle, heavy and instructive. I didn't come here to give you a lecture, she continued. I came here to remind you of something. Or maybe to teach it for the first time. Her eyes swept the room slowly, pausing on faces, letting each child feel as though she spoke directly to them. When her gaze landed on Mr. Penley, he shifted, his posture stiffening as though bracing for impact. Sometimes, Jasmine said, her tone even but unyielding, we assume we know who someone is based on how they look, or how they speak, or where they sit in the classroom. But the truth is this: power doesn't always wear a name tag, and dignity doesn't need permission. And when someone tells you who they are, believe them. The words cut clean through the auditorium. No theatrics, no slogans, just truth, heavy and undeniable. Heads nodded slowly. Some students lowered their eyes. Others glanced at Amara with new recognition. Even the air seemed to shift, thick, with something unspoken. Amara's heart pounded, but this time it was not fear. It was pride. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen, protected, vindicated. Her truth had walked into the room and stood taller than every doubt that had tried to crush it. When Jasmine finished, she did not linger. She closed her notes, thanked the students for listening, and stepped back. The silence that followed was louder than applause. It was the silence of a lesson that could not be erased. But the story did not end with the assembly that afternoon. As students filed out of the classroom, Mr. Penley called Amara to stay behind. She hesitated, but something in her told her to wait. He stood by his desk, his fingers pressed against the wood, his voice lower than usual. Amara, he said, I owe you an apology. The words hung awkwardly in the air. He swallowed. Before continuing, last week, when you said your mother was in Congress, I didn't believe you. That was wrong. I made an assumption I shouldn't have made. It wasn't just disrespectful to you. It was dismissive of everything your family has accomplished. Amara said nothing at first. She simply met his eyes. Calm, controlled. For the first time, it was he who seemed small. Finally, she nodded once, a gesture both firm and final. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition, and that was enough. At home, the mood was lighter. Jasmine chopped vegetables at the kitchen counter, her phone balanced on her shoulder as she fielded another call. Amara leaned against the counter, watching her. Today was better, she said quietly. Jasmine glanced over, eyebrows raised. Yeah. Amara allowed a small smile. I think Mr. Penley finally figured out who you are. Her mother smirked, still peeling carrots. About time. The two shared a quiet laugh, a rare moment of ease. For Amara, the storm that had built inside her for weeks had finally broken. What remained was not silence, but clarity, because sometimes justice does not come as punishment. Sometimes it comes as presence. A woman walking into a room, speaking truth without raising her voice, and leaving behind a silence that could never again be mistaken for doubt. The assembly had ended, but its echoes lingered long after the students shuffled out of the auditorium. What Jasmine Crockett left behind was not just a speech, but a silence that weighed heavier than applause. It was the kind of silence that rewrote things, shifting the ground under people's feet, whether they wanted it or not. For Amara, the change came slowly at first. That very afternoon, as she walked through the crowded hallway, she noticed eyes lingering on her. Not mocking this time. Curious, respectful. Even Elise caught up to her, her voice lowered. Your mom was amazing, she whispered. Amara's reply was quiet but steady. She usually is. It was not a boast. It was truth spoken plainly, finally without fear. For weeks, she had carried the weight of disbelief, the sting of dismissal. But now, even Elise, who had looked away when the moment first happened, could no longer deny what had always been real. At lunch, Amara sat at the same table, where silence once swallowed her. But this time, her classmates glanced at her differently. Some with admiration, some with embarrassment, some with the awkwardness of people realizing they had been wrong. No one dared to laugh. The silence that had once isolated her now wrapped around her like armor. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, whispers spread. Some staff praised Jasmine's words, calling them powerful, needed, unforgettable. Others muttered about being blindsided, uncomfortable with the directness of her message. But even among the critics, there was no denying it. The moment had struck deep. Mr. Penley, normally quick with banter, sat quieter than usual. He had given his apology to Amara, but the weight of his mistake lingered. For the first time, he had to sit in discomfort, forced to confront the limits of his own assumptions. At home, Jasmine carried on with her schedule, as relentless as ever. Calls from Washington, emails from her staff, interviews with journalists who wanted her take on policy, on hearings, on the latest national storm. Yet within the whirlwind, she paused. When Amara came into the kitchen that evening, her shoulders lighter than they had been in weeks. Today was better. Amara said simply. Jasmine smiled knowingly. I told you, baby, you never have to shrink. But Jasmine also understood what her daughter had endured. She knew the look of someone carrying invisible wounds. She had worn it herself as a young lawyer, dismissed by judges who could not see past her skin or her age. She had worn it as a candidate knocking on doors, hearing people say, "You don't look like Congress." She recognized the silent armor Amara had wrapped around herself, and she knew how heavy it could become. Outside their home, the story had taken on a life of its own. A parent who attended the assembly mentioned it to a local reporter. Within days, an article appeared, Congresswoman Surprises School with Lesson in Belief. It was a small piece, tucked between city politics and sports scores, but it spread online, shared by parents, teachers, and activists who saw something larger than a single school event. Messages began pouring in, some from strangers thanking Jasmine for reminding them that their own children's truths mattered, others from critics accusing her of grandstanding. Jasmine read them all with the same calm. She had long understood that truth, when spoken clearly, would always divide a room. But for Amara, the impact was more personal. In class the following week, Mr. Penley opened a discussion with a question. What makes a leader credible? His eyes, unavoidably, found Amara first. She did not raise her hand. She did not need to. For the first time, her silence carried power, not dismissal. The entire class knew the answer was sitting 2 seats from Elise, wearing her pink hoodie, carrying her mother's name, not as a shield, but as a fact. Yet, change is rarely clean. Not every student welcomed the shift. Some whispered behind her back, annoyed by the attention. Others overcompensated, suddenly eager to befriend her. Their motives unclear. Amara noticed it all, but did not bend to either side. She had learned something more important than popularity. That truth, once spoken, could never be erased. One night, as Jasmine folded laundry in the living room, Amara asked the question that had been simmering in her heart. Why did he laugh? Mama, why didn't he believe me? Jasmine paused, holding a shirt in her hands. She met her daughter's eyes with a steadiness born of long battles. Because sometimes, baby, the world struggles to believe what doesn't fit its picture. People carry their own small boxes, and when you don't fit, they try to push you aside. But that's their weakness, not yours. Amara nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. It was not an answer that healed everything, but it was one that gave her clarity. The weeks that followed brought subtle but lasting change. Teachers began framing their lessons with more care, aware of the weight of their words. Students who once ignored Amara now asked about her sketches, her science projects, her thoughts. Elise, quiet and unsure, tried to mend the silence that had stretched between them. It was not perfect, but it was a start. And for Jasmine, the moment at her daughter's school became part of a larger story. In speeches across Texas, she carried the lesson with her. She spoke of classrooms where disbelief still crushed children. She spoke of the danger of teaching silence instead of confidence. Her words resonated with parents and grandparents alike, those who remembered being dismissed in their own youth, their truths brushed aside. For the African American elders who heard her, the story struck deep. It was not just about a congresswoman and her daughter. It was about every moment in history when black voices had been laughed at, dismissed, erased. It was about the weight of being told you don't belong and the power of standing tall. Anyway, Amara may have been just 12, but her struggle became a mirror, a reminder that the battles for dignity are not only fought in marble halls, but in fluorescent lit classrooms, in key lunch, in the silence. After a chuckle, the impact was not a thunderclap, but a steady ripple. A teacher in another district showed the article to her class. A parent in Houston read Jasmine's words to her son. A grandmother in Atlanta told her church group, "This is why we must keep listening to our children." And through it all, Amara carried herself differently. Not louder, not boastful, but steady. She had seen what it looked like when truth walked into a room and refused to bow. She had felt the shift in air when disbelief was forced to reckon with presence. She had learned, painfully and powerfully, that her voice mattered. The world did not change overnight. Mr. Penley still taught his lessons. Classmates still bickered over TikTok. Congress still battled itself in endless hearings. But for one girl in Fort Worth, and for countless others who saw themselves in her, the story had already shifted. Because sometimes the greatest impact does not come from policy or headlines. It comes from a single moment when silence breaks, when laughter is swallowed by truth, when a child realizes that her voice does not need permission to matter. Years later, when Amara thought back to that Friday morning in the auditorium, she could not recall the exact words her mother had spoken. The phrases blurred, as speeches often do with time. But what she remembered, clear as daylight, was the silence that fell over the room when Jasmine Crockett walked in. It was not the kind of silence born of indifference. It was the silence of recognition, a silence that declared, "Here is truth, undeniable and present." That moment became a hinge in Amara's life. Before it, she had learned how easily truth could be dismissed. After it, she carried the certainty that truth, once spoken, could change the air itself. She grew into that lesson, year after year, letting it shape the woman she would become. By the time she graduated high school, Amara's name carried a quiet strength among her peers. She was no longer the girl laughed at for speaking too boldly. She was the girl who had lived through dismissal and come out steadier. At her graduation, she walked across the stage with her shoulders back, her eyes scanning the crowd for her mother, who was there. Despite congressional votes waiting in Washington, Jasmine had promised long ago, "I'll always walk into a room for you." And she had kept that promise. College took Amara eastward to Howard University, where the walls carried the echoes of generations who had come before her. There she found herself among young people who burned with the same hunger for justice that her mother had carried into the courtroom and into Congress. She majored in political science, not because she loved multiple choice exams, she hated them, but because she could not turn away from the questions that mattered. Who gets to be believed? Who gets to be heard? In turning on Capitol Hill, she learned to walk fast, speak slow, and listen harder than anyone around her. She carried the memory of that classroom like a compass. Whenever she sat in a meeting where her suggestions were brushed aside, she thought of Mr. Penley's chuckle. Whenever she stood in a crowded hearing room and saw young interns looking unsure, she thought of her mother's words, "Don't hand them the scissors." But Amara's journey was not only political, it was deeply personal, spiritual, even. She remembered the art that once lined her mother's house, the framed prints of black painters, the candles that burned with scents of vanilla and oak. She carried Africa with her, not as a distant concept, but as a living connection. In college, she joined cultural groups that explore the roots of diasporic identity. She wore Ankara prints to events, braided her hair with beads that clicked softly when she walked, and told anyone who asked that her story was tied to something larger than America. Her relationship with her mother deepened as well, no longer just a parent and child. They became partners in dialogue. Two women, at different points in the same fight. Jasmine, weathered by political battles, shared strategies on endurance. Amara, fresh with youthful fire, reminded her mother of the unshakable clarity of beginning again. They did not always agree. Amara was sharper, less willing to compromise, but they recognized in each other the same unyielding devotion to truth. And what of the wider world? That small moment in a Texas classroom became a story retold in countless ways. Teachers used it in seminars about bias and belief. Parents shared it at kitchen tables, warning their children, never let anyone laugh you out of your truth. Churches wove it into sermons about dignity. It was no longer just Jasmine and Amara's story. It had become a parable of recognition, a reminder of how fragile belief can be and how powerful it becomes once restored. For elders in the African American community, it touched a wound both old and raw. They remembered being young themselves, saying things that adults or teachers had dismissed. They remembered being told, "You're imagining it," or "Be realistic," and they knew the cost of swallowing words until silence became a second skin. Amara's story gave them hope that the next generation might not carry that same weight, but perhaps the most powerful legacy was the way Amara chose to return years after her own humiliation had been healed by her mother's presence. Amara walked into classrooms herself. She stood at podiums, sat in folding chairs, and met the eyes of children who hesitated to raise their hands. She saw them, the quiet ones, the ones who knew their truth might be doubted, the ones who glanced around before speaking, and when one of them spoke something that made the room still something too bold, too proud, she leaned forward, her voice calm and sure. "Say it again. We're listening." That was the inheritance Jasmine had passed down. Not wealth, not privilege, but presence, the unshakable willingness to step into a room and declare, dignity does not ask for permission. It is tempting to think of legacy as something grand, monuments, bills passed, names carved into history books. But in the Crockett Blake household, legacy lived in smaller, more enduring ways. In the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings, in the rhythm of gold hoops clicking against the phone during late-night calls, in the soft but unbreakable conviction that a child's voice deserves belief. By the time Amara entered her 30s, Jasmine's name was etched firmly into political history. But Amara's own name was beginning to grow, not as a shadow of her mother, but as a new branch of the same tree. She spoke less of positions and titles and more of classrooms, of the sacred duty adults have when children trust them with truth. She told her story not to center herself, but to remind others of what silence costs. And so the diurnal rhythm of generations continued. Jasmine had broken barriers. Amara built bridges. Together, they embodied truth. That history is not only written in marble halls, but in ordinary rooms, classrooms, kitchens, the front porches where dignity is either believed or betrayed. The story of Jasmine and Amara is not unique, though it is extraordinary. It belongs to every black child who has ever been laughed at for daring to speak pride. It belongs to every mother who has ever walked into a room to defend her child. It belongs to every elder who has ever wondered if their struggle would bear fruit in the lives of those who came after. And so we end not with applause, but with a question. Are we listening? When our children speak, whether in classrooms, at dinner tables, or in the quiet moments when their eyes search ours for belief. Are we truly hearing them, or only waiting to reply? Because the lesson of Jasmine Crockett and her daughter is not just that truth matters. It is that truth requires witnesses. It requires us. And if we fail to believe, we do more than dismiss a child. We dismiss a future. Stories do not end when the words fade. They echo, they ripple outward, touching hearts that may never meet the people at their center. The story of Amara Blake and her mother, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, is one such story. It began in the quiet humiliation of a classroom where laughter dismissed truth. It unfolded into a moment of transformation when presence broke, silence and dignity stood tall, and it lives on now, not in textbooks or headlines, but in the countless homes where parents and grandparents are still asking, do we believe our children when they speak? For our people, belief has always been a battle. Across oceans and centuries, we were told that our voices carried no weight, our words, no authority, on plantations, in courtrooms, at polling stations, and yes, even in classrooms, our truth was treated as myth. But time and again, we have risen, we have spoken anyway. We have sung spirituals in the fields, sermons in the churches, chants on the streets, and testimonies before Congress. Our survival has never depended on permission. It has depended on faith, faith in God, faith in one another, and faith that our children's voices matter even when the world laughs. That is what Jasmine Crockett reminded us. When she walked into her daughter's school, she did not come to prove herself. She came to bear witness. Her presence declared to every child in that auditorium and every elder who hears this story now that dignity needs no introduction. Power does not require validation. And when truth enters a room, even silence must bow to it. But what then is our responsibility? It is easy to applaud Jasmine's courage and Amara's resilience. It is harder, but far more important, to ask ourselves, what would we have done in that classroom? Would we have laughed? Would we have stayed silent, eyes down, while a child's pride was dismissed? Or would we have spoken? Would we have listened? Would we have believed? Our legacy demands more than admiration. It demands participation. It demands that each of us in our homes, our churches, our neighborhoods become witnesses to truth when it is spoken, especially by those whose voices are most easily ignored. So let us remember Amara, not just as a girl who raised her hand, but as a mirror. Her story asks us to recall the times when our own truths were dismissed, when we felt invisible, when laughter cut deep, and it challenges us to ensure that the children around us do not inherit that same silence. Perhaps you are a grandmother listening now, watching over a child who comes home with eyes lowered, carrying a story they are afraid to tell. Perhaps you are a retired teacher, remembering moments when you could have done more. Perhaps you are simply someone who knows what it means to be doubted. Whoever you are, know this: your role is not small. To listen with respect is to give life. To believe a child's words is to plant a seed that may grow into courage. In the end, Amara's journey was not about politics or prestige. It was about recognition. She learned, painfully but powerfully, that silence can wound, but presence can heal. And she carried that lesson forward, returning to classrooms not to boast of who her mother was, but to remind others of who they themselves could be. That is the mark of true legacy. Not the fame of one generation, but the empowerment of the next. And so, as this story closes, it does not ask you for applause. It asks for reflection. It asks for commitment. It asks for the quiet, consistent courage to say, the next time a child speaks, we hear you. We believe you. Say it again. Because the future will not be written only in Congress or in courts. It will be written in the everyday spaces where children dare to tell their truth. And if we listen, truly listen, then perhaps one day laughter will no longer be the first reply. Instead, belief will